Since Russia invaded Ukraine, progressive US and EU-led sanctions have been designed to punish Vladimir Putin and cripple Moscow's economy. Should Beijing invade Taiwan, how would China cope with similar sanctions? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Yin Khvat. Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Raymond Sung, Deputy CEO of think tank Taiwan New Constitution Foundation, and Eric Huang, Taiwan's main opposition party Kuomintang Deputy Representative in the United States. Now, in the early months, analysts questioned whether the sanctions against Russia were actually working. They did nothing to deter Putin from his invasion of Ukraine. Let's take a quick look at what those sanctions are. Now, this list isn't exhaustive. So there's sanctions on Russia's debt payments using international reserves. There's also Russia's removal from the SWIFT system. Russian banks are excluded from financial systems and their assets have been frozen, and Russian firms are barred from borrowing money. Raymond Sung, let's talk about these financial measures first. Okay. What do they prevent Russia from doing?
Yes, let's talk more deeply about what sanctions are. And all those measures are designed with a purpose to to persuade Russia to stop the war. But it will not take immediate effect. It will take time. Sanction will take time and take implementation from a network of countries and as wider as possible. So that's very important. And all those are not aimed at Russian people themselves, but at Putin and Putin's circle, including oligarchs who provided Putin the finance to keep the war going. So you see the ban on financial transfer measures, and of course ban from the supply of arms and ammunition and military equipment and technology, and also from the financial sources for Russia's income. For example, their sale of oil and gas and their sales of supply, and also to try to delay their transport. For example, ban of shipping and aircrafts landing, and all sorts of things. With the major aim is to try to delay, try to stop, try to drain their financial sources for keeping the war going. So it will take time, and it will take. It will not take immediate cessation of hostility, which is an unrealistic aim to put too much on the shoulder of sanctions. And the third point is that sanctions are a double-edged sword. They will hurt Russia, they will hurt Putin's regime, but it will also hurt those who impose sanctions on Russia. For example, when we see for the European countries, when they stop importing Russia's oil, they will suffer the rising prices, inflations of oil and energy and food prices. So they will also suffer the consequences. So it's really a very, very complex issue in a now global and multinational global economy.
Eric, Raymond just said there that the sanctions will take time. Can we go to a little bit of detail in one of the financial sanctions? The debt payments that were banned drawing from the international reserves. How does that work in terms of stopping, as Professor Sung said, stopping Putin financing the war?
So economic sanctioning will take two folds, in my opinion, one internally, one externally. For this specific case for Russia, President Putin will have less resource to finance the war, to buy weaponaries, or to move money internationally, whether it's to finance group that helps. You know, nowadays, warfare is not just fighting a weapon. It's about psychological warfare as well. So they will stop their ability to do that. And I think most importantly, for an autocracy, for dictatorships, a lot of their oligarchies within the society, their money are hidden internationally, not within their country. So perhaps this can mount internal pressure for Putin to stop the war, but in my opinion, so far that hasn't been working and hasn't been the case.
So there's around 300 billion in foreign currency reserves that's been frozen. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so what sort of dent does that make on Russia? You said you believe not much?
For Russia's economy, yes, it's working. They're hurting. It's not just Russia. I think the rest of the world has felt this as well.
Which is what Raymond also.
But for a dictator, so it becomes a game of mounting pressure and playing chicken, right? So one can argue because it is working, because this is hurting him internally, he will bring out the iron fist even more because he cannot show any weakness towards this. So it's working, but it's also counterproductive in some sense.
So you're saying that it puts pressure on Putin. It might be to the extent that he does something reckless.
Or he is at a spot of, in his opinion, he's in a situation of no advantage. So he's willing to gamble. In the very beginning, maybe people can argue it was an irrational choice, but then he might continue this trend of logic of thinking.
Raymond, if we can, before we move on to China's role in this, can we talk a little bit more about Russia's economy?
Right, yes.
Even though we've said, maybe it doesn't actually provide the deterrent, it is providing some pain. Let's talk about what the US and EU are attempting to do.
Yes. May I ask to a different layer or deeper layer to that we just discussed? And firstly, that the sanctions now imposed on Russia is not aimed at Russian people. And actually, it's a deliberate design to be a targeted sanction, targeting the Putin's regime and its oligarchs. So now, for example, the travel bans it's only for Putin and those close associates of them and their families, and not for the Russian people in general. So it's a latest phase of sanctions to redress the deficiencies that Eric just mentioned about crippling Russia's economy, about creating hardship for Russian people. So that's very clear. That's a targeted sanctions. And also, a sanction is not without any effect. It will take time. For example, for Iraq, when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990s, and the UNSC Security Council of the United Nations imposed general bans on Iraqi export of oil. That takes 6 years to come to feel the pressure to be enough for the Saddam Hussein regime to negotiate a pact with the United Nations to release partially the ban. But the fund raised from the limited oil export was put into fund to compensate for the environmental harms caused by Iraqi. And also in case of Iran, when the Iran nuclear weapons or development of nuclear enrichment program, and also UN Security Council imposed a ban. And also that takes 6 years to have the pressures built on for Iran to build Iran nuclear deal with the 6 nations. So it will take time. So it will not just have no effect at all, which I need to make very clear. And also we can talk more about the evasion, of course, and the Russians trying to find alternative links and try to find new supply chains, try to find new channels for moving their monies. And they try to connect with countries like Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, or Venezuela to try to evade those sanctions. So that's the flip side of what we just talked about.
So in that sense, do you think it's accelerating, this
yes,
split?
It's
in the
forming
order?
of a separate bloc from those people for Western countries, United States and the North American and European and East Asia countries, including Japan and Taiwan. And we are now witnessing a forming of those countries with China, which is a major market who is buying Russia's oil and Russia's goods to let Russia could get their revenues. and also buying those oils with ruby, not with US dollars.
rubles,
so
yeah.
they are trying to create a separate block from those general global economy.
Eric, let me introduce some figures. So on the BBC, it said that there was an official drop in GDP, of Russia's GDP, of about 6%, 6 to 8%, but an unofficial drop of 30%. What do you make of those figures?
Well, I think these figures are significant. I think any dictator or president facing this kind of economic situation will have to make adjustments towards his people's living standards. But however, I think in Russia's case, in the dictator's mind, the economy is going poor because so one thing is not working, then he will actually even need a victory more. So he will be less reluctant to stop the warfare to a point where he can call it a success. So he might adjust that definition, but he will have to have something. Otherwise, I think the mounting pressure from the economy and the defeat in the military front, which is what it is actually, will really hurt his leadership.
Raymond Sung, there are some analysis of Russia, perhaps, as you said, it's a long-term process.
Yes.
The issue of defaulting on debt payments. So this is what we need, what countries would need to pay out to their bondholders.
Yes.
Russia has, well, this is probably up for debate, possibly defaulted on a payment in June.
Yes, yes, yes.
However, Russia is arguing that they made the payment,
yeah.
but it wasn't received because of international sanctions.
Yeah.
However, what we understand is that, if it's deemed to be a default, then this will impact Russia's ratings,
Yes.
Market access, and financing costs for decades to come.
Yes, yes.
Can we talk a little bit about this?
Right, that's a very good question about, and a good example to show that actually Russia is now a rogue state, both in terms of political and military terms, and also in economic and market terms, which means that effectively, very crudely saying that those effect of those sanctions are paint Russia as an outlaw. And nobody should, and no country should do business with Russian and Russian enterprises. And so that created totally different pictures for those debt payment and default problems. For example, in normal transactions, and a country who is facing default will be viewed as a problem for international concern, and everybody should come to any international institutions like IMF should come to its aid to prevent those disruptions to global economy. But in this case, when Russia is outcast and to push into a corner in order to drain its financial sources, and it's becoming its own problems, and it's actually partially being a desired aim to let Putin get a taste of what will come from the sanctions. And but Putin is no doubt is a crazy person who launched this unnecessary war, and to nobody's benefit besides him and his very close associates, and creating huge mess for the global economy. And the war should be stopped. And it's causing tremendous human tragedy and cost. And so compare that to reach that aim, to let Putin stop its hand, no matter what he tried to get, it's a desirable goal. It's a desirable goal. So for that, we have to pay the price that to have the Russian economy to run into trouble, which is a necessary cost for stopping the war.
Eric, so Raymond has just said that it is necessary. Obviously, there will be implications, maybe not all of them desired, but it is necessary to carry out these sanctions on Putin, on Russia. Can I ask you, Raymond also mentioned the formation of blocs. Do you think that this could accelerate the world towards a Cold War?
I think to answer that question, well, first of all, this economic sanction efforts, it is uniting the more, I don't want to say the Western countries, but the democratic liberal front of the world, right? So it is uniting. The coalition is there, has been formed. In terms of a Cold War, I think you might have seen some semblance of it, but it's not in the totality of that. So you see the concept of that, but it's more complicated these days. For Russia, might be more transparent, but especially for facing a country like China, it might be more difficult. Especially if we go not that back to just a month ago, when the White House of the United States released its national security guidelines, right? One of the three main points that I got out of it is that they are breaking this idea of democracy versus autocracy, right? They want to get together all the like-minded people who are willing to work with America or a country like Taiwan, a democracy.
So it doesn't matter if you are not a democracy. Is that what they're saying?
It's not that it doesn't matter. It's just we believe there are situations that country hasn't had the ability and opportunity to become a democracy, but we want to offer them that path and opportunity to work with the democracies and become part and celebrate the life that we enjoy.
So simply being defined as not a democracy, any countries that are not democracies are not
automatically the other side,
enemy.
right?
Yes. Okay. Very interesting. Raymond, on China, whilst China hasn't provided direct military support to Russia, obviously we have their no limits partnership, and tell us how they have been supporting Russia.
Right, it's sanctions are a cat and mouse game. So for Russia, it wants to have alternative market for its goods. It wants to have alternative sources for its finance, and China is the biggest candidate to provide Russia with those. And actually, it has been providing those. For example, China is buying Russian oil with ruble and not with U.S. dollars. And which created the market for Russian oil, and so that for Russia can have this source of income. And also, China is buying supplies and goods from Russia, so it provided economic cushion for Russia. Also, it linked Russia with other partners and trade partners and markets. So really, all those are has been done in a deceit and discreet way. And of course, the leaders, under the leadership of American and the government of Americans being aware of this and has been warning China for not doing that and warning that it will face consequences if it continue doing that. But the flip side is also that China is practicing this. And also, they learn from each other. Actually, Russia is now learning from Cuba, for example, and Iran. That's the techniques and the channels to evade sanctions and evade their effects. And China now, by aiding Russia, to providing a cushion for Russia, is also practicing, I believe, I'll argue. Practice to prepare itself, to brace itself for the prospect of being sanctioned, and how to lubricate, how to find those routes and alternatives. That is also needs learning, and China is part of it. I think there's no denial about it.
So it's very much self-interest, isn't it? It's not just the business transactions of the discounted oil, it's actually forward planning.
And also, of course, what's the ultimate aim is to the event of invading Taiwan.
Okay. Eric, on that subject, the Taiwan Policy Act, promoted by Bob Menendez and Lindsey Graham, approved by both House and Senate committees, has in it some sanctions against China, not just for military action. What's your analysis of those measures?
Well, first of all, I think it's very, from my observation, this reflects my own view, not my party's view. I think America is practicing some sort of strategic clarity, some sort of, but it's not military. It's everything but military. They want to make everything clear, except for the scenario of an invasion, that they support Taiwan.
I see. It's very interesting.
And this is a further evidence of that. This is a further effort of that, right? So why are they placing these sanctions on China? It's because they want to make a statement, right? So with that, I will also want to add that I don't think these sanctions will stop the Chinese whatsoever, right? It's not there to deter the Chinese whatsoever, but the Americans nevertheless want to make it very clear, right? This is where we stand, right? Because whether or not they can send military aid in that case of an invasion from the Chinese to Taiwan is very complicated, right? It's contingent on domestic politics, it's contingent on the president's current policy and his political leverage, right? But they want to make very clear that where they stand. Like sometimes, in life, we want to do something, but we're just not able to do it, right? So Americans want to tell the Chinese, first and foremost, we want to defend Taiwan, right? So this, I think, and this act, if you really look at the economic sanction part of it, from my analysis, it serves more as an alarming bell than deterrence, right? So I think Americans want to know in advance if the Chinese is up to something, right? They want to prepare for the scenario, and when they are doing transactions that is deemed suspicious, right, try to create loopholes in these sanctions, you will know, right, what kind of actions they might be planning, right? So you will. It's like weather bill of what the Chinese are thinking in terms of what they want to do in Taiwan or to Taiwan.
I just wanted to clarify. So you said that you don't think that the sanctions outlined in the Taiwan Policy Act would be enough to stop China, but they are an alarm bell.
The Chinese, well, first of all, China has been preparing for this for a very long time, right? Second of all, again, deterrence for deterrence to work, you are looking at one of the preconditions is the leader of the country has to be rational, have to think about people's livelihood. And I don't think Xi Jinping fits those descriptions as well, right?
But do you think that these sanctions go far enough? I mean, could they go a lot further? Or should they?
In terms of the depth, I think it covers pretty good ground.
Let's talk about, just for our viewers, some of those. So there's sanctions on officials, financial institutions, also sanctions on people or organizations related to financial messaging services. So obviously SWIFT is an example of that. There's also sanctions on extraction of oil, gas,
right,
coal, mineral, imports. And there's also blocking of U.S. property for I guess, the people who are sanctioned.
So for this, I'll bring just 2 points, 2 observations. First, Chinese, you might argue this plays in Chinese's favor. They've been creating their own banking SWIFT system. They want to internationalize their own money. If I was Xi Jinping, I would use this against my party's enemies. If I were him, I would just use this to in the name of preparing for the scenario, right? And, just freezing the money from my political enemies. One radical thing he might do is he might change the prints of renminbi, right? He might print new money, right? So to get the people in the name of preparing, but really what he's doing is to push his further enemies out of the political party.
So this actually all works to his advantage?
I wouldn't say it's advantage, but he might play this in his hand.
Okay. Raymond, do you agree with that?
Actually, we are seeing this. Actually, I can agree with that, what just being said by Eric, that Chinese economy is turning inward looking. And Xi Jinping is telling his people that they should prepare for hardships. And all those are responses to U.S. sanctions. But we need to, may I separate the issue into 2? Actually, the primary aim for the proposed Taiwan Policy Act is to enhance the capability of defense for Taiwan. So all those military aids and the military cooperation proposals and other aspects of strengthening Taiwan's resilience for democratic, to defend its democracy are aiming at strengthening Taiwan's capability. But the sanctions we are now seeing from the U.S. government about prohibiting U.S. persons to support Chinese development and production of semiconductors, and to prevent the supply of technology and chips to Chinese firms, are trying to widen the technology gap between the United States and China, try to slow down Chinese development and acquisition of technology and military productions, trying to put a lid on Chinese expansion on its military capability. And those are really seeing effects. So that's why Xi Jinping is trying to persuade his people that, and also Eric mentioned that Xi might play those cards into the favor of his own party and himself.
Raymond, further on that, a Washington official said in September that they were also considering, I guess I don't know if it's separate to the Taiwan Policy Act, but the administration is considering a package of sanctions to deter a Taiwan invasion that go beyond the current sort of technological semiconductor sanctions. What do we know of that, or what could this involve?
Of course, then we will imagine those package of sanctions will be close to what is now imposed on Russia, and the totally exclusion from financial market and financial channels of transactions, prohibiting the payment of debts by international regimes and the network like SWIFT, and trying to prevent Chinese market payment of debts from their reserves, which is calculated in US dollars. We will see, and of course, trying to prohibit China from gaining strategic supplies like oil, and prevention of Chinese goods into global markets. But of course, those are now proposed and imagined, and also China's looking very closely about those, and the US also is watching very closely. But the difficulty is showing themselves in those aspects because Chinese economy is so interwoven with the global economy. It's hard to imagine those effects and those sanctions can go to the full length, which is will cause huge disruptions of goods, of supplies of technology, and money, financial circulations to the world economy. So everybody is bracing themselves to let's hope that will not happen. But once China will should invade Taiwan, those are in place, and China will be facing that circumstances, and also the world will facing that eventuality.
Eric, as Raymond just mentioned, the entanglement of the Chinese economy into these Western economies is much more profound than Russia's. So obviously it will be a very difficult endeavor to do that. Do you think China knows this, and therefore, in effect, any economic sanctions aren't effective, or the threat of these sanctions? They also, in terms of what the resilience that they're building up, as Raymond also mentioned, helping Russia, establish other financial systems, the internationalization of the yuan. Do you think that these are all actually useless? China knows that.
No, I don't think this is useless. And once again, I think making a statement is very important. Defending Taiwan using defense capability, military capability is one thing, right? We always stress the importance of creating a coalition, international allies for Taiwan willing to support us. This type of effort, it fits in that purpose, right? So it's like military, you need to have drills, right? This is type of things economically, you try to unite the people that will help Taiwan, help the democracy, help our peace-loving people, right? It's just, again, it's like what I said about Taiwan policy as making statements, right? And for the Chinese, they are likely to take on further actions that will alienate the rest of the world, right? And through this process, right, Taiwan can once again tell the rest of the world what we believe in and why people should help us, right? So for the Chinese, of course, it's not going to deter them. But they're gonna, first of all, they can hide as much as they want, but they're gonna feel this, and they're gonna feel this that will hurt them, their people, their economy somewhat. But if their leader choose not to look at it and turn the other way, which is very unfortunate, but at the very least, I think the rest of the world will know, what their intentions are and what they plan to do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The Biden administration announced sweeping new regulations on October 7th to cut China off from certain advanced chips made anywhere in the world with U.S. equipment. The law is aimed at undermining China's efforts to develop its own chip industry, as well as slowing Beijing's technological and military advances. The curbs are set to impact areas such as Beijing's development of nuclear weapons modeling, hypersonic weapons, as well as AI, supercomputing, and cloud computing. Now, critics have argued these chip export controls could create a Sputnik moment in semiconductor innovation, rather like the surge in R&D and spending in the US after the Soviet Union launched the world's first satellite. Raymond Sung, how do you read the situation? I mean, obviously, we've just been discussing this, but let's talk specifically about chips.
Chips. That's a very, very crucial difference from those Sputnik moments, which are very, very early precedents. And also now China is fiercely competing with the United States, trying to get the latest technology for their military purposes. And those has been spotted by the U.S. government and administrations from the last administration so now those has been going on for about 4 years now, but it's getting more and more expensive now. I mean, it used to take the shape of preventing the supply and from the and acquisition of U.S. technology and products for those dual-use companies, military and civil convergence companies, because they found that usually Chinese will conduct those exercises through the hand of apparently civil servants, civil students and technicians, and in the United States university and labs, and to put a stop on those loopholes. And also it advanced it to the designated list of blacklist enterprises, which provide services and provide the arms and legs for the Chinese state aims. For example, in the case of South China Sea, those state enterprises who help China to extract soils from the seabed and to militarize the islets in the South China Sea. And now it's, the latest phase is targeting 2 points. It's talents and supply. It's more expensive supply about all those advanced areas you just mentioned, including AI, advanced logic IC, and semiconductors, etc., and also talents. It prohibits any U.S. persons from supporting the Chinese firms' development and production of their technology. So we see a wave of resignation from the top CEOs and those Chinese Americans serving in the Chinese firms and technology giants. And of course, China is trying to put a stop on those and trying to persuade those persons from resigning. But for those persons, they face a difficult choice. Would they choose to retain their U.S. nationality or to retain their profession with the Chinese companies? Many people say, well, U.S. nationality is so difficult to get. We have to wait for 10 years to get a green card and to get the permanent civil citizen status. So, of course, they will attempt to retain their U.S. nationality. So that's the advances of the latest phase of the U.S. sanctions on Chinese technologies firms.
Eric, Raymond just mentioned there that, in a sense, there is no Sputnik moment. This is a process that's been ongoing for 4 years. How much of a blow do you think these export controls from the U.S. designed to try to slow down this process?
Well, first, I think we have to examine the overarching goal of the U.S., United States, right? So obviously, it is not to push the Chinese far enough for them to develop their own semiconductor capability, right? I think Americans want the Chinese.
But they already are, aren't they?
No, I don't think the Chinese technology capabilities matches of what they need and what's necessary to produce what they want. I think the Americans intend for the Chinese to still rely on the current system, but make it harder for them to get what they want and to produce things that might serve in the purpose that the rest of the world doesn't agree.
So, you are saying that Beijing has no intention to develop its own semiconductor independence?
They might have the intention, but I don't think they have the ability.
Right
and
now.
I don't think they use the United States overarching goal to push them to develop their own system altogether.
No.
I think they want them to still rely on the current system, but just not to use the chips in a way that is counterproductive to the rest of the world, right? So that being said, I think the U.S. should try to slow down some of the movements that Beijing is doing that we deem as unnecessarily. But I don't think Beijing will succeed in terms of building their own capability, primarily because of talents is hard to come by. Precision is very important, perfection actually, in terms of producing these chips, right? So experience, leadership, personnel, I don't think Beijing will get what they need in the next 10, 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Raymond,
Yep.
Let's talk about TSMC.
Yeah.
Let's talk about TSMC, because obviously that is where as Eric was talking about, the
Yes.
expertise, the precision
Yes.
manufacturing. Recently, TSMC suspended work with Byron, which is an AI chip designer, a Chinese one, obviously.
Yep.
How difficult is this for chip companies around the world? Do they feel like they're being forced to choose?
Yes.
To comply with the U.S.?
Yes, actually, it's also happening before. For example, with regard to Huawei, with regard to the previous U.S. ban on aiming at preventing China to acquire the technologies. So the ban was to say that if any product contain 25% of U.S. technologies, that is not allowed to export those products to China. And also TSMC TMSC also has been facing that during that time and has made a difficult choice. And this choice for the previous situation is that do we have to maintain our single track of supply and chain, or do we have to separate into two? One is for doing business with China, the other is to do business with the United States. I think many Taiwanese firms, including TSMC, actually choose the latter part, that they will not abandon their business still ties with the Chinese market. But they are facing more and more stringent conditions, and actually, as we see the expansion of the scope of U.S. sanctions. And secondly, about the effectiveness of those sanctions. In the case of Huawei, actually, we see a very clear impact on Huawei's global market. For example, Huawei was sanctioned for several reasons, for leaving a backdoor for those causing security of information, and also for aiding Iran associated businesses and for other sensitive areas. But the U.S. in position of sanctions on Huawei actually reduced dramatically its production of advanced mobile phones. So it once was the second largest supplier of the mobile phone for the world. But now it's almost being behind the top 10 of the suppliers. So we see the very, very rapid implementation of and taking effect of those sanctions in the space of about 2 or 3 years.
Eric, so this choice, perhaps, that's being put on different companies, and we're right now just talking about chips. I guess this is maybe an example of where you say that we're not in the Cold War yet. If we actually were, it would be very clear where your allegiances were. We would have this complete fracturing of supply chains. Is that correct?
I think that is the case. I think what these companies is preparing for is to diverse risk, to be more regional, right? Because we went through globalization earlier, about 20 years from now. I think they try to be more regionally connected. And you know, one thing is what we know is the demand of chips will only go up. So you need to increase production, right? So there is no clear, you know, black and white anymore. But you know, they are trying to prepare to what might come in the next 5-10 years in more turmoil world if the Chinese decide to do things during the, you know, in terms of the current trend. So these companies will not, it will be hard for them to pick and choose one side, but they have to prepare if that has become the case in the future.
Raymond, for Taiwan, for Taiwanese companies, it should be easier to pick and choose, surely, between the US, which supports Taiwan's national security, and China, which is threatening to invade Taiwan if there is no peaceful reunification.
I have mixed feelings that you raised this question. Actually, in my view, it's very difficult for Taiwanese companies to choose. They've been very, very reluctant to abandon their shares or the prospect of doing business in China or with Chinese companies. That has been going on for 30 years now. Taiwan and Hong Kongese businessmen was first to enter into Chinese market after 1989 Tiananmen Square incident. And all those Western companies are refraining themselves from Chinese company, but who go on firstly, it's from Taiwan and Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. And also they find themselves difficult to withdraw from Chinese market. But we are now seeing a very, very different pictures than it used to be. Because more and more Taiwanese business firms are withdrawing from Chinese, either divert their production base from China to other countries, for example, Vietnam or other Southeast Asian countries. And that's also common to the general flow of capital and firms from other countries, and also or withdraw to Taiwan. So now we see more and more businessmen saying that there's no prospect of getting profits from the Chinese market. We see several complexions of problems combined: raise of labor costs, raise of aging of Chinese workers, and high environmental costs and other barriers for example, moving capitals around. So they are retreating from Chinese company, and of course I will argue that will be even quicker after the 20th People's Congress, because they see the very, very limited prospect that China will change its rule, and very, very unprofessional way of dealing with economic situations in the panel of the Changwei, in the Politburo. So I think Taiwanese will come to their awareness to that they need to withdraw from Chinese market.
Okay, it may be hard to define whether we are headed for a Cold War or not, but there is certainly intense great power competition between the US and China. For years, Beijing has been quietly challenging the US-led economic world order. Raymond Sung, the Belt and Road Initiative is obviously one of the main mechanisms for Beijing.
Yes.
To what extent has this initiative been successful?
Okay, that's also interesting. That's a combination of export of excess state capital within China to export them to apparently try to help the development of infrastructure in other countries, including in Mid-Asia countries, in other African countries, so also the Road and Belt to create a new Silk Road to rapidizing the supply of transport of goods from China to Europe, and also the Silk Road on the sea. But along the road, Chinese building its influence basis, for example, buying or trying to loan, trying to rent the lease from the military or from the seaports along the road for Chinese use, and for Chinese to build this foothold along those Silk Roads. So we see a combination of economic aims and the strategic competition aim. And it also causes scandals. For example, they have rampant problems with corruptions for those domestic actors to try to collaborate with the Chinese state capital movement. And also we see the debt trap fallen because they couldn't pay up the Chinese debt. They have to give concessions to, for example, long-term lease to Chinese state, which really causing a huge problems for global capital and economy. So that's why the U.S. administration says that the assistance provided by the U.S. is different. And also those initiatives are not to defeat the international regime. For example, under IMF, it imposes stringent conditions. For example, to try to prevent corruption, try to be getting those capital development to be responsible and to be sustainable for environmental purposes.
Let me bring in Eric. So in terms of the U.S. response that Raymond mentioned, what has the U.S. response been? Yes, they are concerned. And how have their efforts been to counter this? How successful have they been?
Are we talking about just Belt and Road
Yeah,
Initiative?
just Belt and Road.
I think Belt and Road Initiative for the